Now, before we go into the practice of sacred space and doing ritual, I just want to quickly go through things like tools, magical weapons, altars, but more specifically getting into the directions, movement around the circle, the cardinal points, the elements and things like that. As far as the latter goes, with the elements and the directions, there is a difference between when you're working in the northern hemisphere and the southern hemisphere. So I want this video to kind of be the basis for those videos. So let's get into that anyway. Alright, so just to begin with, I just want to briefly discuss weapons, magical weapons and tools. Now, one of the first things I learned, and I can't remember where I read it, it was way too long ago, is that an adept magician, someone who's seasoned and powerful, can actually go into the middle of the desert completely naked and perform the most powerful magic. They don't need the paraphernalia, they don't need the tools. Quite honestly, you already possess all the tools that you need. You have your mind, your body and your soul. You have your emotions, which directs your will. So you don't actually need any tools. When people talk about an athame or a ritual dagger, even the use of a sword, there you go. You've got two fingers. You point, you direct, you move. So the tools are actually extensions of your own self, your own body. So you can use your own body to actually become the tool. There are, of course, some tools that you can't use yourself for. I mean, I suppose you can to a certain extent. I mean, I remember once I mentioned to somebody on an email group that I was speaking about the same thing. You basically have all the tools you already need. So you have your athame, you have your altar candle, which is your heart. So you do have all the tools necessary. You don't need to go out and buy stuff. But I mean, you might want to buy some candles to put on your altar. And as time goes on, you will purchase items that represent the deities and represent certain things that you feel connected to and you want to feel more connected to. So that's fine. I mean, tools are fine. There's nothing wrong with using tools. But as I say, it's just not necessary. When people start on this magical path, they start reading books about Wicca and witchcraft and ceremonial magic, etc., etc. And one of the things that always comes up in it is tools. You need to have an athame, you need to have a sword, you need to have a wand. You don't need to have any of those things, to be quite honest with you. So if we look at the altar, then yes, you might want to start building up things on the altar. I'm a very simple person. I mean, you can see my altar behind me over there. It needs a bit of a clean today, actually. I've been doing some work and there's some things on there that should not be on there. I'm very simple. I like to be simplistic. I like to keep it zen, let's put it that way. So I'll only have as many things on my altar as are absolutely necessary. I do want to get some vases and put some flowers on there actually, but I'll have to wait for this lockdown to finish before I can go to the shops and start buying things. So you might want to have your altar candle. Your altar candle is just a representation of your spiritual path. It could be just a representation of the deity that you worship. So therefore you might want to have multiple candles on your altar. If you look back there, I've got a skull. For me, the skull represents knowledge, it represents the mind, it represents the horn god with the flame betwixt the horns, and the symbols on there represent, the big one is Pan. I'll show you, I'll try and put a picture up somewhere. Let me just move, wait, let me move this way and then I can put picture of it. I'm trying to get the right position here. I'll put a picture over here somewhere quickly. So I have Pan as the large symbol, and then there's 4 sigils around. So as Azazel or Azazel is at the top, and Lucifer is at the bottom. In the actual symbol at the bottom of Pan, and that to me represents Azazel bringing in the knowledge, and Lucifer being in the head. Now the 2 of those can actually switch around quite often. Lucifer, when I actually do circles, when I do sacred space, Lucifer is fire, whereas in that representation, Azazel is more the fire aspect. So the 2 can switch around. They're both light bringers. But then on the left is Belial, which is earth, and then on the right is Astaroth, which for me is water. So when it comes, and then obviously I've got candles, so I've got 2 pillar candles, or 2 black candles on the left and the right, and a white one in the middle. But you know, it's all representation for me, so it's personal to me. So when it comes to your own altar, just make sure that you have things that are personal to you, that represents the things that you want to move forward with. You know, it's magic, but I mean, if you're looking at witchcraft is the actual practice of a craft. So it's something that you develop yourself. You grow yourself, and you craft yourself. And you know, when it comes to the actual altar top, apart from using metal, don't use metal. It just doesn't conduct very well. Well, it conducts electricity very well, but not in terms of magical energy. Especially iron, which is bad for the Fae. You know, things like that. But try and use wood, clay. There's nothing wrong with using metal, but personally, I just prefer to stay away from it. So you know, you don't need to have fancy altar cloths. You don't need to have a fancy table unless you're doing things like Enochian magic, where you actually need to draw the symbols and have the legs on the layman's and this and that and everything else, and etc, etc. So I'm not into Enochian magic myself. I did look into it way back in the past at some stage, but it's not really me, not at this stage anyway. But you don't need to have all this fancy stuff. All you need is just a top, and you just start building on it. And if you are someone who can't display your altar because you live with people who wouldn't understand, or you have visitors that wouldn't understand, then you can always get a box and put all the items in the box, and then when you're going to do your magical working, you just take them out and put them on top of the box. So you don't need to worry about that type of thing. But anyway, that's enough about tools and magical weapons. As I say, they're not absolutely necessary. They're just nice to have. They become extensions of the body. They don't hold the power themselves. You hold the power, and you project the power through those tools. But now, I want to talk about the directions. So, when you go into sacred space, you have your 4 cardinal points: east, north, west, south, northeast, southwest, whichever you. I always start with east because you usually start with east in sacred space. Now, if you're working in the northern hemisphere or the southern hemisphere, you're going to have a difference because the sun travels in a particular direction, and it's opposite between the hemispheres. And you'll probably come across 2 terms, Deosil and Widdershins. Now, Deosil is to move with the sun, and Widdershins is to move against the sun. And quite often, people in their writing in books and stuff, usually writing in the northern hemisphere, a lot of the books come from that side of the world, and they'll talk about moving clockwise or counterclockwise, and that's wrong. Anybody reading that in the southern hemisphere is going to get completely messed up. So I wish people would stop using move clockwise or counterclockwise, because it's wrong. They should be using Deosil and Widdershins, or with the sun or against the sun. So when we move with the sun, if you're in the northern hemisphere, you're going to start in the east where the sun comes up. You're then going to move to the south, where in winter that's where the sun is at its lowest. So that's the hottest point of the day. And then you move to the west where the sun goes down, and then to the north where it travels in the underworld back to where it gets reborn in the east. If you're in the southern hemisphere, it's the opposite. So it comes up in the east, it moves to the north, goes down in the west, travels through the underworld in the south. So you can see the difference. So if you say to somebody you need to move clockwise with the intention of moving with the sun because you're in the northern hemisphere, the person in the southern hemisphere is going to get buggered up because they are now moving Widdershins instead of Deosil. They're moving against the sun. So you can see why this is important. Throat today. You can see why this is important to actually get it right and not use terms like clockwise and anti-clockwise. So with the videos going forward, when I'm mentioning movement within the circle, whether it's Deosil or Widdershins, whatever it may be, I'll use those terms, Deosil and Widdershins, but I'll also, instead of saying east, north, west, south, I'm going to use east, and then east and west, but then I'm going to use day and night. Day representing the time of the day when the sun is at its peak. So as I say, in the northern hemisphere that's in the south, and the southern hemisphere that's in the north. And then night being the opposite of that. Just to try and make things easier. Otherwise, when I'm explaining something and I say, okay, move from the east to the north, if you're in the northern hemisphere, move to the south, if you're in the southern hemisphere, move to the north. It's just going to get a bit convoluted. So that's what I'm going to do. Right, so that's movement within the circle. Oh, there's one other thing. Why do you move in the opposite directions? If you're doing something esoteric where you are working with entities outside yourself, you are projecting energy out, maybe you're doing healing for another person, that type of thing, then you would move Deosil, so that's with the sun. So it's kind of like imagine a spiral that's moving outwards. That would be Deosil. If you're moving Widdershins, which is against the sun, then you're doing work which is inner. So you're moving inward. You may be doing work where you're moving down to the underworld, into the inner worlds, to go and speak to the Fae, or speak to the gods down in the underworld and things like that. So there you would move. The spiral would then move inwards. So that would be Widdershins. So that's why you would move in the opposite directions. You obviously can move Deosil with the sun if you're doing positive magic, and you can move against the sun if you're doing negative magic. So there's all these representations of the directions that you move in. So let's get on to the elements. Now, this varies from tradition to tradition. Tradition to tradition. I'll talk this morning. I'm going to have some coffee. Alright. So, that varies from tradition to tradition. I almost got it right then. If you are working ceremonial magic, of things like Wicca, which are very ceremonial magically based, then you'll be you'll have a representation of air in the east, fire in the day position, I hope you got that right now, water in the west, and earth in the night position. But if you are looking at traditional witchcraft, British traditional witchcraft, or sometimes now called modern traditional witchcraft, you there's a different representation. You often have fire in the east, because fire is the morning sun, the rising sun. It's the light bringer, therefore it is Lucifer. It is any deity that represents a light bringer. And the sun rises and it brings the knowledge, brings the light. And then you move to the day position, where you would have earth. This is your hottest time of the day. It's the flowing fields. It's where it's summertime. So east is the springtime. The day position is the summertime, so that's where you have earth there. Then you move into the west, where water is. Water is usually always in the west. Many traditions have the water in the west. It's the watery divide. It's autumn. It's where you become old and you die, and therefore you move over the river Styx and you move into the night position, where you become the ancestors. So then the night position is air. This is where the Silver Castle is. It's the position of Rhiannon. There's lots of representations. There's lots of deities that represent each of the cardinal points as well. So you need to actually study up on this, but I'm just giving you the basics. So you can see the difference. But in all of these representations, there is a cycle. There's a movement of the sun, but there's a cycle of the year. So you've got spring, summer, autumn, winter. It's also a cycle of life. So you've got birth, middle age, old age, and then ancestral. So the old age would transition from, you would die and you would become the ancestors, and then you would be reborn, reincarnated, and you are born again. So the circle represents the cycles. So depending on what representation the elements have for you, you would place them in those particular points. But that cycle doesn't change. The cycle is always the same. So I think at this point that's enough information to actually give you, as I said before, we go into the creation of sacred space and the ritual acts. I wanted to just clear up that you don't need the tools. So if you're reading Golden Dawn literature, for instance, you don't need the dagger when you're doing the lesser banishing ritual of pentagram. You don't need the wand when you're doing the supreme invoking ritual of the hexagram, for instance. So you don't need all those tools. You can just use your fingers, your two pointer fingers, well, middle finger and pointer finger. So when you're doing the Kabbalistic cross, you can point with your fingers. When you are doing the lesser banishing ritual of the pentagram, you can draw the pentagram and you can push through the center. So as I say, you don't need the tools, and I obviously needed you to understand what I mean, because I'm in the southern hemisphere. A lot of the people who will be watching this will probably be in the northern hemisphere, so I need you to understand that when I talk about the position of day and night, I'm talking about the cardinal directions, and where they are for you, depending on where you are in the world. So I just wanted to clear that up and prepare you for the rest of the videos. So the next video we're going to go into the Kabbalistic cross, and then we're going to go into the lesser banishing ritual of the pentagram. From there we'll discuss the Kabbalistic sacred space, how I was taught it by Jacobus, which I used to always think was just a better version of the lesser banishing ritual of the pentagram, but in progressive years I've come to understand it's something different. It is different. It's different to a banishing ritual. It is banishing, but it's also invoking and setting up we'll get into that when we get into banishing rituals. And then from there we're going to have a look at the Wicca, circle casting. We're going to have a look at traditional witchcraft, I'm also going to discuss the Star Ruby, which is Crowley's version of the Lesser Banishing Ritual of the Pentagram. I think I mentioned all this in a previous video anyway, so let me not get into it now. Discuss what I needed to discuss for today's video, so let's carry on. Hope you enjoyed this video. So yeah, if you've got any value out of this video and the other videos in this playlist, then just smash that like button, share, comment, and if you haven't already, please subscribe, hit the little notification bell, and I'll see you in the next video. Cheers.